This is Kathy from Gadget Top 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Iroshizuku Tsuki-yo. I'm going to test it in a variety of pins and nib sizes ranging from a Pilot Extra Fine to a 1.5 stub nib. And in today's video I'm going to be featuring the Platinum 3776 with a medium nib. This ink I think is nice for everyday writing. That's what I enjoy using it for. And the 3776 medium nib is a nice everyday writer, so I'm curious to see how it does. I'm going to start with the Pilot Fine Extra Fine nib. This is a Pilot 38G with the extra fine. I don't know what I called this. It's a 78G. I'm not sure if that's what I called it. And usually this extra fine nib is pretty much unpleasant to write with, but with this ink, this is nice, especially for a nib this fine. It's very legible, and it was pleasant to write with. I could see myself writing with this extra fine nib, especially in something like a Hobonichi or a Jibun Techo that has the small grid. That was very nice. I'm surprised. All right, next is another 78G with a fine nib. This is what I'm using for my everyday writing right now. This ink, in my experience, very limited experience at this point, is a pretty, I would call it a wet ink. It's nice and flowy in this fine nib. This was nice and smooth. I enjoy writing. Right now I'm using it to write on Apica paper in a traveler's notebook. I write with it a little bit every day, and I really enjoy it. That looks nice. All right, next I've got the 3776 Platinum with a medium nib. There's some feedback. I wouldn't call this glassy smooth. I feel the feedback, but it's pleasant. It's smooth. It's not scratchy with I hear this term used a lot with sailor nibs, a pencil lead type feedback. That's what I'm feeling here, and I can hear that sound. I know a lot of people like that sound of the scritchy scratchy nib on the paper, and that's what I got with this nib and ink combination. All right, next I have a Pilot Prera with a cursive medium nib, also known as the 1.0 stub nib. Okay, you can see this nib is a little bit drier, and like with other inks, since it's so dry and the ink is spread out over a wider area with this stub nib, it changes the look of the ink a little bit. It's a little more pale, so that's something to consider when you're using this cursive medium. All right, next is a Nemosine Singularity with a 0.6 stub nib. Now this is much smoother. And you can see it's quite a bit wetter than that Pilot cursive medium. I would call this really smooth. That was nice. The nib just glided across the paper. And finally, I've got a Jinhao X750 with a 1.5 replacement stub nib in it. All right, I always love doing these writing samples with this stub nib. I don't use this a lot for my everyday writing. Since I've been doing these writing samples, the last little bit of ink that's in the nib, I use it to make my headers for my daily journal, and I just enjoy writing with that. All right, I'm going to let this dry a little bit, and we'll take a look at some other writing samples on other papers. I've got my little ARC notebook, and when I used it in my Sailor 1911, I wrote in here. And these are just, you can see I use it in my everyday writing pens. And so in the extra fine, again, it was just pleasant. It wasn't, I mean, it's an extra fine. It wasn't glassy smooth, but it wasn't scratchy either. It was just pleasant. And reading this back, it's very legible. The platinum medium, again, on this paper, it had that pencil type feedback, if you like that. In the Nemosine, it was very smooth. The Prera, with it being a drier writer, it's a little bit, the ink is a little bit more pale. And with all of these were where I drew X's and tried to do the little smear. And this ARC paper, it just soaked into the paper and dried very fast, even with this stub. Normally with the 1.5 stub, you get a pretty good size ink smear, but look, barely any at all. It just really soaked into the paper quickly. I got a little bit of, I wouldn't hardly call that feathering, just ink spread. The edges are a little jagged. In the Nemosine, you can't tell by looking at it, the edges are a little more sharp, but the ink did want to spread because this is was a wetter nib. Let's see if it wanted to bleed through here. The only one that really you can see it coming through is the 1.5 stub nib, and I see on the Pilot medium and on the fine just a little bit of ink wanting to come through, and that's, I guess, a factor of it soaking into the paper so quickly. On Rhodia paper, let me see, can I get it? It just looked really nice, just a nice everyday writer. And I made a note that it was exceptionally smooth, this extra fine, compared to how it normally feels. And I put a little heart beside it just to remind me that I would use this as an everyday writer. That's very uncommon for that extra fine. The fine was also smooth, it was wetter. You can see on Rhodia paper, it doesn't absorb into the paper quite as quickly. But I made a note, they were all exceptionally smooth. Just a pleasant ink to use. On my 20-pound copy paper, you can see again in this absorbent paper how it's soaked in really fast. You don't have much ink smearing. Even on this fine nib, you can tell it was putting down quite a bit of ink. Let's see what the bleed through look like. Everything had a little bit of bleed through except for the Pilot Pereira with the cursive medium, with the stub nib. It did not bleed through. In my opinion, it doesn't look as good in that nib. To me, this Pereira cursive medium is just a good nib to use on poor quality paper, where the way the ink looks is not your top priority. You just don't want it to bleed through the paper. Let me see real quickly in my Leuchtturm. Let's see if we've got any sheen. I'm seeing just a faint halo of red sheen. It came out in that wet nib. I just love how dark it is. Not a whole lot of shading because this nib was so wet. Just the faintest bit of red sheen. It's not super noticeable, but very pretty. And let's see. Again, not a lot of red sheen. I'm seeing some shading on this Tomoe River paper. Just, let's see, up here on the platinum medium, I'm seeing a little bit of sheen, even on the fine right here. But it's not an overwhelming amount of sheen. It's just an occasional little bit. All right. Just a pleasant ink to use in a variety of nibs, and a smooth writer. Dries and soaks pretty quickly into lesser quality paper. It's a good overall ink. I enjoy using it. All right, if you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.